again Regina Jacobson and Laura Tan for being here. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us. So today's session is entitled Self-Identity and the Construction of Narratives, and the construction of narratives even. And I always give a bit of an introduction of the ideas. So I'm just going to start with the introduction, and then we'll go on to our conversation with our speakers. So today's session is going to be focused on the ideas of self and identity and how these contribute to who we are as artists. Our development of personal identity involves a dual movement between the external and the internal. The very construction of ourselves as people and artists depends on an internalization of the beliefs and values of the society we live in and the ethics and behaviors inherited from our families. The external is internalized. And at the same time, although it may be a cliche to say that every painting is a self-portrait, this idea does highlight the fact that the work we make is an expression of ourselves. It's the internal externalized. I'm always a bit ambivalent about recurring to Freud because much of his thought was messy and sometimes problematic, and yet his theories have conditioned language in relation to consciousness and the self. In analyzing the first movement, the external internalized, Freud's concept of the superego is a useful construct, as he recognizes the importance of the internalization of external values as part of the triadic construction of the self, based on the id, which is our instincts and our impulses, the superego, which is an internalization of external value structures, and the ego that acts as a sort of bridge between the other two forces. Although it's not original, because Freud used several terms and metaphors that throw us back to Plato and Aristotle, his theory is compelling because it evokes the clashes between dissonant driving forces that resonate within all of us. And in the work of today's speakers, Regina Jacobson and Laura Tan, this play between internal and external spaces is palpable, showing how the two collide to create powerful images that recreate a feeling of this difficult journey that requires we internalize external expectations and externalize internal needs. Neuroscience today has fascinating things to say about consciousness and the conception of self, and how we forge the notion of a stable identity. Antonio Damasio's work identifies 3 levels of consciousness. And I just want to mention the most complex level called extended consciousness, which includes what Damasio calls the autobiographical self, only available to animals with a more sophisticated cerebral cortex. This is particularly important as it's a sense of self that orders and recreates first-person experiences into a narrative that relies on memory and past experience. It's the story of ourself. I'm starting to delve into the world of neuroscience and psychology, something that's always fascinated me. So I want to make clear that my interpretations are those of a layperson. But I do think that these disciplines are pivotal in understanding what the self is. Anil Seth researches the way in which we are predictive machines that learn from experience to create a sense of self. For him, just like consciousness and reality, the self, and this is just a fantastic idea, is what he calls a controlled hallucination, based on internal and external inputs and how we use past experiences to establish a best guess predictive model from which our sense of self develops. So the self itself is far from being an objective fact. It's a useful construct, a controlled hallucination that allows us to navigate the world and create various facets, including our narrative self, which exists over time and relies on memory and past occurrences. This creates a fascinating predicament, or maybe even a paradox, like the symbol of the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, that evokes self-referentiality. The self is a construction, but it's also the place from which we construct.
Yeah.
And today's session, as you can see from my introduction so far, is related to human psychology, not exercised as an academic discipline, but an organic emergence of understanding and expression that comes from the lived experience of the self. And in this way, there is an emergent psychological element in both Regina and Laura's work. The relationship between art and emotion has far back roots, and in the Western Greco-Roman tradition, inevitably harks back to Aristotle again and his Poetics. For Aristotle, the aim of tragedy was for people to be aroused to feel emotions, namely pity and fear, in order to evoke compassion and awe. Aristotle borrowed the term catharsis from medicine related to physical purging. And although he only used it once, it was later developed and popularized by, you guessed it, Sigmund Freud. And catharsis is an interesting concept as it relates to the power of recreating emotions to purge the body of their negative consequences. The reason it's interesting to foreshadow our conversation today is that it draws on the power of recreated emotions, including those in art, to create a profoundly transformative experience. And keeping transformation in mind, I'd like to suggest the idea that in revealing ourselves and exploring our own fragility, that's when we reconcile ourselves with our vulnerabilities and are empowered to move beyond them, or at least live constructively with them. Empowerment through vulnerability is a valuable and complex subject which recurs in many disciplines. So let's go back to the idea that all work is autobiographical, in the sense that it expresses and is made by our sense of self, which is also a story forged by our memories and experiences. Arguably, some work is more immediately autobiographical, and this formulation can be expressed in many different ways. Using as examples the literary devices of stream of consciousness, as opposed to constructed symbolic narratives, brings to light a couple of powerful options for revealing personal experience. Stream of consciousness brings to mind first-person accounts of events. The use of self-portraiture as a testimony and a tool to construct narratives is present in Laura Tan's work, as well as numerous other artists, including Paula Modersohn Becker, whose short-lived and introspective journaling of herself led to incredibly evocative paintings, and the first known female nude self-portraits. And Claude Cahun used photographic self-portraits as a fascinating journey of exploration into the construction of self, gender, and identity. And if you want to look up any of those artists, you will have all of those references in the chat. So feel free to take a look, and later on you can have a look at those artists if you don't already know their work. And on the side of constructed narratives, on the other hand, we see artists develop a highly personal symbolism and a mythology in their work, including our speaker, Regina, today, and other contemporary artists such as Paul Arrigo and Gérard Garousta, whose visual narratives become sophisticated symbolic constructions that intertwine personal narratives with borrowed mythologies to forge a highly personal world. In both the cases, possibly thanks to the humanizing characteristic of empathy, the personal has the power to transcend the individual, creating an identification on the part of many different viewers. And I have a personal interest in the use of the self in making work, as it's something I often use in my own paintings. This focus on identity in the writing of narratives has become increasingly important in both the construction of artistic narratives, as well as the construction of historical narratives. To be visible is to be empowered, and to be heard shows that there is never only one story to tell. The desire for grand narratives was a totalizing and ultimately violent force that saw idealism and rationality bury too many selves, identities and narratives, both metaphorically and literally. The significance of personal experience in the understanding of neuroscience is a welcome addition to a growing focus on personal optics in reviewing histories, theories, works of art, and post-colonial readings, feminist readings, and queer readings, and necessary responses and processes of revindication that shine illuminating perspectives on subjects that, in an overly axiomatic and supposedly rationalist age, silenced far too many voices. The role of identity politics in the narratives and fictions that we construct is something that recurs throughout the dialogues in many different ways. And today, it's my pleasure to welcome our two speakers, Regina Jacobson and Laura Tan, to our conversation about self-identity and the construction of narratives. And I'd like to just start by sharing a few images of Laura and Regina's work. I'm also going to include one slide of my own work, just so that you have fresh in your mind, although I'm sure that you know their work, fresh in your mind a few images before we start our conversation. These are just a couple of examples of ways I've used myself in my own work. These are pieces of work from Laura Tan, from both the self-portrait series and the selfie series, which is a nice distinction. And this is a huge piece of work with 3 panels by Regina Jacobson. So Regina and Laura, it's just a pleasure to have you here. And what I want to do, as I always do, is I'm going to ask you each one question just to launch our conversation, and then we'll see where it takes us. I'm going to start with you, Regina, if that's okay.
Sure.
Your work's infused with your personal experience, including working in the fashion industry and what you've learned about human nature. How do these elements come together in the genesis of a specific painting? Do the ideas stay with you and macerate for a while, or do they come in flashes? Do you have a concept or an idea, an image that you want to create, or is it none of those? How does it work?
Well, thank you for having me today. It's really an honor to be here, and thank you for everybody who's come to participate in this discussion. I'm going back to what you were saying. I think my work, I pull from all my experiences, and I think I start with just middle-class American family. I was born in 1951, mom, dad, 2 daughters, a cat and a dog and a bird. and raised going to church, belief in God, which is carried through with me till today. So that's one influence. 2 influences. My mother suffered incredibly with a narcissistic sociopath disorder, which affected our whole family. So it was a burden that carried through until she died last year. And that's an influence. And I take from all of these influences. One of the other ones is I was in the fashion industry from the time I was 15 until I was 49. And my love for fabric, I mean, really, that goes back to the age of I was 3 when my grandmother made all of my clothes. But all of these things I've pulled into my love for history and literature and scripture and fairy tales. I love fairy tales, and I just so all of that is what I gather in, and I purchase things, and I have some things back here because I'm in my house instead of my studio, but I brought in some of the things that influenced me, and so all of those things they're all brought together, and I pick from them. And that's my construction. That's the foundation of the work, especially in the cult of beauty, which is set up as it's a cult. From the fashion industry, I had it's actually a religion. You know, if you live in there, it's a religion, and where beauty is worshipped, and it's venerated, and so that comes into play, the emotional aspect of the fashion industry and the standards that are set up through society and the glamour industry on us, is how I chose to, it's my megaphone. It's kind of how I structure things around that. So it's a cult that worships beauty, and my symbolism is I use the mannequins and the dress forms, the dress forms. I apply characteristics to these different figures. I apply to my dress form. It's kind of like a god. It's a standard that requires us to be beautiful, to be accepted into society. We need to rise up to these things.
There's so many different influences that actually then come to exist in the work. Laura, what I wanted to ask you first was about, you've said in some of the conversations that we've had that your paintings constitute a sort of formal diary that captures your appearance and also the feelings that you have on a specific day. How did that process of work evolve, and how long have you been painting self-portraits in that way?
I've been using myself as my own model, probably, since high school, just as a way to learn to draw, to teach myself how to draw, because I love to draw. When I was a child, I was always drawing horses, and my parents were, my father was a writer, and they were both musical, and we had a very, very healthy, very robust, happy childhood. No trauma. I mean, like, I'm blessed. But the point of that is that they supported me being an artist. When I was little, I was first grade, I won an art award. They were like, great. And my dad brought me the roll of paper. So I always loved to draw. And I've always been fascinated by people. I'm a gregarious person socially, but personally, I'm very private and very introspective. And I think, I began drawing myself as an academic way of teaching myself how to draw probably around high school, more seriously, and have always, that sort of organically evolved into, I'm a notebook person. I don't want to bring a notebook here, but like this isn't it. It's like I've always had journals, and this is how it started, since I was 18 or something. I've always been a person who wrote and drew things that were right in front of me because I love the process of drawing. And as far as myself, I was always my most accommodating model. I love the figure. My website is very not up to date, but I live in Miami, Florida. It's gorgeous out. So going out to the beach, I do a lot of watercolor sketches, beaches, and but people don't sit still. And because I love the figure, one of the things, I'm not digressing, but it does come back. At the beach in Florida, you see people wearing nothing to a lot of clothing. And it's kind of like young and old, no matter what size or shape, there's almost no other place than the beach, if you think about it, where people are basically naked and they don't care what they look like. And if they do, they still don't care because they go into the water. And so I think, just growing up here in Miami, that was one thing that I always kind of like, really loved, was that it's all out there. And as I think I got older, so I always, I was my own model. I wanted to draw myself. I wanted to become a better artist. I love drawing from life and observation. And I've been working for about 40 years as a professional artist. And I think for most of my lifetime, I ventured into other subjects because I did my sketchbooks and my journals, which had lots of portraits of me, for myself only. It was a very private practice, but diligent and very aware. But it was so personal and so private that what was art for me and was the most intense and that I got the most out of, it was never made for public display. So I didn't put it out there as my art practice. And I would try still life, or I would do cow paintings or still life, or you know, other subjects for a while because I have the skills. But I could never sort of maintain a passion for it. And that's not good for your confidence, you know, because if you do still life for a year or two and it wasn't like it naturally evolved, or one thing, you know, when you're working on something, it kind of like you have 5 or 10 more that you see and you can't wait to get them going. That never happened except with my notebooks or my collages. There were a period of time where I did collages, which are, again, self-portraits, but they were dialogues with myself about stuff that I was going through. But again, if it's a journal, it's for your own personal needs, whatever they are. And I suppose I hit 50 at one point, and a lot of times I wasn't posting or sharing work, or people would say, like, what are you doing? And I often found myself not really very confident saying, oh, I'm doing some still life work, or I'm with this gallery, because what was close to my heart, because I didn't really believe in it. That's what we're talking about, vulnerability and identity. And as an artist, I really didn't believe in the identity that for 20 or 30 years, anybody kind of assigned to me as, oh, I saw the still lifes, they're wonderful. And it isn't that I didn't authentically love them, but it really wasn't what I had passion for. And you hit middle age and you're like, if I die tomorrow, or if I have a month, or you get a little older and you don't have that much, what is it that I love as an artist? You know, it's like, I'm done trying to impress people or whatever my ideas were. And honestly, to myself, it had always been hands down, I do myself.
It's fascinating how there's this kind of collision of the internal spaces of reflection that we need to build and that we create automatically, and also the kind of external projections onto us, what we feel that we need to be, and how we actually then integrate the way in which we work in the world with how we're making our own work. And you kind of develop your own symbolism, your own way of working in that sense. And it was interesting for me to find out that actually there was some symbolism that crossed over in, especially Laura, your collages, and Regina, some of your work. And so that symbolism, you've already talked to Regina a little bit about how it's developed and what it's based on. But do you feel that play between the external and the internal, and how do you feel it?
I was thinking about it this morning. I think I isolate my female figure, which is, part me, but also, others that stories that I've collected. And I think it's a very intimate space, but you're allowing the viewer to come in and participate. Well, you can't see it. Those internal spaces for me are, the isolation of the figure is an internal aspect of their struggles. It's almost a confessional, a personal confessional, that aspect of it, of facing our demons. When somebody views the work and connects with it, that's the internal to the external.
Actually, you kind of preempt one of the things that I wanted to ask, because when we were talking, you've both had experiences where people have had really strong responses to your work.
Yeah.
And that is really fascinating. I don't know if either of you want to kind of talk about it or give a bit of context of what happened.
I started into my master's program. I really went to get my master's because I didn't know how to paint a narrative. I was stuck, well, not stuck, but I really desired to be more narrative, and I was just painting the figure. I'm the solo figure with no environment, palette knife backgrounds, and I have always loved stories. So going back in and learning how to paint a narrative, I decided through that time to only paint the female figure instead of both sexes. And I was wondering if my storytelling would connect with men, because, you know, it's very specific about women, but I think the one symbol that I use, that circle that's on the ground, it's this idea of being accepted and rejected, and how we view ourselves in that manner, whether we're accepted by other people. And this was something that totally transcended the gender aspect of the work. And so I had that large triptych up in a gallery one time, and it was the first time I had shown it, and I was really nervous about how people would react and things like that. And I saw a man standing in front of the painting, and his hands were kind of out like this, and he was standing, and I approached him from his back, and I walked around, and he was crying. I'm not a little bit, he had big tears running down his face, and I said, oh, I'm the artist, can I answer any questions for you? And he looked at me and he said, how did you paint me? And here was this woman in the cruciform hanging over the circle, you know, that it was him. And I was so delighted to see that that message was not just, you know, how pretty am I, or, you know, but it's, you know, am I enough? Am I successful enough? Am I fast enough? Am I smart enough? Am I enough? And it was so satisfying to see that response, and the connection with a work like that.
How about you, Laura?
Yes, I have to say yes, many, many times. So when I had you know, once I embraced this idea that I am an artist, and I know myself best. I was in a group show, Armand Bowling Fine Art in Jupiter, Florida, with some who have become very dear friends of mine, other artists that I admired a lot. And the first real, you showed the first one with that set, the kind of the introductory image, but the painting that followed that, cutoffs, it was pretty much a burnt sienna, and I'm kind of haggard looking. I don't know if haggard, but disheveled. Anyway, it was a group show, the opening for the gallery, and all the artists in the gallery were there, and it blew my. I was super nervous because I had never shown a self-portrait in a gallery as my work, and this was only 3 or 4 years ago, and every single woman artist, it was Suzanne Scherer, Carla Walter, a bunch of people I don't need to name, in turn, separately, they were all there, said, wow, you do this, because they didn't really know that as my work. They had seen a still life, or they had seen, you know, some other tiny things that were not me. So when they saw that, they said, they all came up to me and told me how they understood that feeling, like they identified with whatever I was expressing. And so that was, it was just like I exhaled. It was validating, because they were artists who had their practice and were, you know, kind of like chugging along for many years, professionally doing what they do. And that was great. And then in terms of the gender thing, you know, I really don't have a plan. There's a feeling that I it's very much got to, you know, sort of evolve. And there's no agenda behind whatever I present, but, you know, I intuit my way to where I arrive. And in that same show, that same night, a gentleman came in who was a collector, a regular collector at this gallery with his wife, and every artist's work was up. So this was kind of like the icing on the cake. And he said, you know, he found me and he said, you know, I've got a lot of the work that's in here, and I love what Armand shows. He said, but I can't I can't stay away from your painting, because when I walked in, I felt like I was seeing an old friend. And, you know, for me, it was just kind of like he said, I want it. I mean, you know, it's just like, you know, so when he said, I felt like, you know, and he was standing in front of it, and he said, I feel like this is an old friend. So, it was really nice. You know, it was really nice. And there was another old gentleman in another show who, with a different painting, and again, it was called Maruska in the Museum Square. And he came up and asked me one time, because again, they were all self-portraits. There were 3 of us in a show. And he turned around and said, you painted this, I see. I said, yes. And he said to me, you look really sad. Were you sad? And I mean, I wasn't sad. I didn't paint it trying to be sad, but he said, I just you know, did something happen? I don't need to know. But he wanted to kind of know the story behind it. He felt for it, and he was, you know, so empathic. And I said, yes, you know, it wasn't a moment of sadness, but there is a kind of melancholic aspect that definitely comes through that piece more so. So, you know, things like that. Like Regina said, it's just, it's nice, you know, and there was one more very quickly, because I love music, and I was at a residency on the west coast of Florida, and, you know, at the end of the residency, they have open studios, and again, a couple walking through my studio, and the gentleman, so I'm doing the opposite genders because, you know, I'm a woman, whatever. And he looked at this one where it's very specifically, it's called Looking Back. And I came upon a photo of myself when I was about 30, and I kind of gasped. And this was about two years ago. And I instantly saw myself now looking at, you know, back at that same thing. And I thought, I have to paint that. You know, I'm going to photograph myself looking at me 25 years ago, whatever. And so that was nearly finished. It was on my easel. And he turned around and he looked at me and he said, I know this song. I love this song. I'm a musician. I'm a singer, songwriter. But I could never live with that because it's too much like my own music. But I love it. And that to me was just like, all right, you know, that made my heart sing. So
yeah, it's that beauty also of when you have something that's quite in a personal experience that infuses work, it's still, like I said in the introduction, it transcends and reaches far beyond the individuality of the experience that you've kind of used. And it's a nice kind of point of view, that idea of the music when you look at the work, because sometimes when I look at Regina, your work, I get a very sort of theatrical feel. There's something very the light is very controlled. There's a real kind of presence of all of that constructed narrative that comes together, and I kind of feel like there's music playing.
Yeah, it's very grand. I feel it's very operatic in scale because the paintings are large.
I was in drama for years and years. I wanted to be an actress, so you know, I think staging and lighting has been a part of my work. Not always. That's you're seeing my theatrical background with I have lights and gels, and it's become. I say half of the work is set up and staged with my my things I collect. I go out shopping for those things, and I'll find something that just inspires me, and I'll add it to my collection. So that's one way it works. And then other ways that I gather from my things that I've taken pictures of, and I put them into Photoshop, and I create a being that's an assimilation, a collage, if you will, of parts and pieces. So it's what I want to achieve with the piece and how I start my creations. But you are seeing my theatrical background.
That's wonderful, because it's that the way in which, whether I always kind of find it fascinating when people say that they make paintings that are more objective, because actually we infuse ourselves in our work inevitably, even if it's just by what we decide to look at and what we decide not to look at. We're already kind of putting ourselves into that decision-making process.
Yeah, I think if we look at ourselves, and I know a lot of people ask, one of the questions I'm asked most is, where does all of this stuff come from? And really, it was in the master's program that I learned to look inside and see who I was. You know, like Alice in Wonderland, the big question in that story is, who am I? Who am I? And that's a good question. It's just to start gleaning and gathering and, you know, making a journal. I wrote, you know, lists and drew things and sketched until I had this set of the, you know, staging that I pull from to cast my paintings.
I always think it's kind of interesting, no matter what you do, you know, to look back. Like Elina, I felt that you were, you said so much great stuff in that first 15 or 20 minutes. I'm glad it's recording, because there were like all these triggers. But you know, it's almost like, for me, it's always interesting to see the timeline in terms of any artist's development, because you can always find certain threads that are you know, were given priority, not necessarily consciously all the time. And for me, with my own work in that regard, that's what is exciting even now, and especially if it's so hard to do this without sounding like, you know, you're egocentric, but if you look back, for me, if I look back now, I can see sort of the same me, but you know, I literally see myself changing. I see my gaze changing, how I'm, you know, recording what was there at the time. And so if I wasn't focused on, because I'm never focused on a particular narrative, it comes out anyway. And that becomes what's so fascinating about, for me, all creative work, which is that, you know, the discovery that happens when you look back at all of the decisions that you've made in the moment without actually focusing on them. And sometimes, like, you know, if I'm drawing, time has been challenging for most of us this past year and a half. Personally, I've moved twice in the last 16 months, I think, and then COVID, and I have a day job. So it's been challenging, to say the least, to kind of restructure the work time, but it forces a certain prioritization, right? Because I don't have the luxury of just like no job and no time. I have to make sure I get it in. And I think it's always interesting, you know, when I get lost, if I know I have a little time and I want to do just to keep my vocabulary there for myself, I'm not focusing on anything in particular other than, again, it's like, for me, it's like playing an instrument, drawing, painting. But while I'm doing that, I'm also lost in like a timeline, like you know, I've said sometimes it's like a trigger, a reel. I remember being 7 and seeing my mother's stomach with all her wrinkles and thinking, oh, she's like an old lady. Cause I remember it's like a vivid, snapshot. And I look at myself now, I'm like, oh my God, my mom was probably only 50, not 85 like I thought she was when I was, 10. So it becomes little things like that that sort of connect to, like you said in the beginning, Elina, like, your outside, your inside, your timeline, your life's experiences. So you sort of become very sensitive to the moment, like here I am in the moment, and also simultaneously aware of your entire lifetime, because it's like one of those time lapse reels where they're, in The Fifth Element, where Lulu is seeing the whole history of the world. I mean, it's one of my favorite movies. That's what happens in my brain when I'm working. So I'm not thinking about anything. But then when I look at the piece later and I see like the lines or where I erased or what marks are there, it's always a surprise. Like, I don't remember doing that because my head was like in the rest of my life that's already happened. Even though in the real time, you're actually, mixing paint and using everything you've learned to kind of like respond in the moment. So it's sort of a performance with yourself, which is easy because nobody's watching and nobody knows,
But it's also fascinating kind of to link back to that idea of the neuroscience, which I'm getting so interested in, is this idea that the self doesn't actually exist as a static thing. It's something that we build out of our experiences. It's a very rough, well, maybe not rough is not the right word, but predictive mechanism. And so it's very responsive to everything that's happening, both now and what happened in the past. And
Right.
So in a sense, the work that you make is also the part of the definition of what it is to be you.
Right.
And I'm quite interested in that kind of link between whether as artists and people you tend to split those two functions off, or whether you kind of bring them back together. I'd love it, Regina, if you want to add anything.
I'm the opposite, that I have a theme that I paint into, and I love it. And so again, it's my cast of characters, where I'm not ever in my work. I don't think I can stand to paint myself, but I love painting these other characters that are telling my story. So, but I definitely have series of paintings. There's The Cult of Beauty, and there's Woods and Groves, and there's Curiouser, which is out of the Lewis and Carroll book, and Momentous. I mean, so I can always jump around, but they're always there. They're solid. I know it's themed, very themed for me.
Yeah. So it's almost they've kind of developed a parallel world, or maybe part of the world.
Yeah.
They have their own personality or
Mine's definitely
momentum.
allegorical, or definitely allegorical work.
Yeah.
And we had mentioned between the three of us that Elina, you're the moderator, but you're also an artist, a wonderful artist, and you're sort of not in the middle, but you do both. You have symbolism and metaphor, and you're kind of split the middle between the two of us because we are pretty different.
Yeah, and I think that's what's fascinating about making work, because if we all made the same kind of work, it would be such a boring world. But the fact that we all then go off in different directions, but it's interesting because listening to what you were saying about yourself and the way that you used your own work, and almost the need to recognize that the self-portraits were actually the integral part of your work. For me, there was a kind of similar process that I always felt that I used my self-portraits to reset. So if I needed to find something technical, or if I was trying out a new way of painting, I would recur to myself because I was there and I like painting from life. And so there was that kind of immediacy and also the intimacy. But at the same time, I'm starting to realize that it's more than just that. It's more than just a reset or a technical thing. There's actually something about the way in which you can be yourself and honest when you work with yourself. And I know that not everybody needs that, but I think that I do, in a sense, kind of have a bit of both. I use quite a lot of symbolism, but I also need that kind of closeness. And it brings up that question that I think is a really important question, and it probably will come up again in the future, but it's that idea that we talked about, which is almost the idea of empowerment through vulnerability.
It empowered me dealing with the subject of my mother, which was really at the core of Cult of Beauty. Learning who, through the paintings, through, you know, having to deal with all my woundedness and her woundedness, really empowered, gave me an understanding of who my mother was, helped me to come to a spot where I could forgive her for being who she was. It was really interesting. And I think other people that have the same kind of things going on in their lives, maybe it's not their mom or it's something else, but they look at the work and there's this identity that's made. But I definitely, through working out my own demons, gave me the power just to get a rise above it. You know, it's really helped me rise above these things, but at the same time, I do think a lot of people connect with it.
I do think that there is absolutely something to be said about the power of the universal in a very particular experience.
Yeah.
And so because of the honesty, it actually connects really closely with others, and it goes beyond the individual.
Yeah, that transparency is a very special thing.
You can't, I think you have to do what's true to you. Let me keep it simple. And for many, many years, what made me, what was most gratifying and honest for me, I self-censored, because who wants to look at a drawing or a watercolor or a painting of me, somebody they don't know? So even if I looked at Egon Schille's watercolors and drawings, you know, as a young an adolescent or a college student, and I was like, or Van Gogh or Rembrandt's, and I just felt like Giacometti, you know, his lines, and I kind of like in a completely non-verbal way, it was like my heart pounded, and I could feel some of that when I did my work for me. But so I think what I'm saying is, if that's what excites me, then share with everybody else, because really you can't, that's authentic, that's honest. And musicians do it all the time. You know, they write songs and ballads about heartache or, you know, whatever. And I just, you know, it took me a long time to realize that that was the scariest thing for me to do, was to sort of share what I love. And then the rest of the stuff I do, and you know, I do it because I love that too. And I think that willingness to share basically opened my diary.
Yeah.
Invited lots of people, lots of artists that I don't even know, and artists that I love. A couple have bought my work. I've bought some work from artists, and you know, one artist, I love her work. I don't know if she's here or not, but it doesn't matter. And I did a drawing a year ago. And again, it was after a move, and I was exhausted. And I teach elementary school by day. So, you know, it's tough. And, but I hadn't drawn in a while, we were moving, and I had gone out and had a few drinks. It was Friday night, a happy hour in December. And all I wanted to do was just like crash. And at the same time, I was agitated, and it was because I hadn't given myself the gift of that art time, my conversation with me. Resetting might be it, you know, hitting that reset button. But like you said, it's more, it's deeper than that. And so it was like 10 o'clock, and I looked in the mirror and I started drawing. And I kept going and going and going, and I had sort of half gotten undressed, and I was talking myself out of working, and I was feeling really guilty and agitated too, and I was tired. And I sat down and did a drawing, and I finished it at about 3. I always put the time on my drawings. I don't know why. But it was like, no, I've got one last thing to do before I go to bed. And I sat down. I thought this would be an hour, hour and a half. But at least I did that. I had that dialogue. And it was 5.5 hours later. And I loved this drawing because, you know, I was kind of like, again, sitting down on my stool, getting undressed, a little Degas like. I was tired. I had a little bit drunk, not a lot, just a couple of glasses. And, you know, after a crazy week. And I love this drawing. And it was like, that was important.
It's really interesting how you can have that feeling of connection with a work that's been made in a very immediate moment, but you can also have a feeling of connection with a work that is a more kind of theatrical piece, so that the emotional connection can exist in both of those contexts.
I asked Regina to clarify a reading that I have of her work. I asked if she was raised Catholic because I see in her selection of formats and a lot of her imagery, it feels almost like a Catholic sort of imagery. And I wanted to know if I was right in that reading, or if it's the theatrical nature of her work that's sort of harkening back to a Renaissance. And that's why the Catholic feeling comes across. And for Laura, I wanted to say that I love your work. It reminds me a lot of El Fayum portraits. And you have like that sort of compression of values towards the light. That's very sort of like the mortuary portraits from El Fayum. Do you feel influenced by those mortuary portraits, those Egyptian portraits?
I don't know the work that you're referring to, so I would have to say no. You probably just see me trying to like find something that feels correct to me.
I thought it was a really great question, and I do rely heavily on the Catholic iconography to portray my religious cult, but I take it and reverse it. And it's not a worship of God. It's not a Christian language. It's I'm using it to portray my this religion that I have set up, that worship of idolatry. It's a idealized beauty. And so I thought that was really cool that he asked me that question, though.
There's painting as individual objects, individual works of art that exist in somewhat in isolation. But several people have commented on the theatrical nature of your art. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to expand on that, about the notion of art as installation. I know that you have some thoughts about all these works working together in a single conceptual installation, and that literally putting this on stage in a theatrical context, where these are the characters in a theatrical setting, that requires an installation piece, that these are elements in a single installation, and
a total immersive environment. When I was doing the master's and creating this series, The Cult of Beauty, I just, and maybe it was because of all the years in the theater, that I just envisioned the whole thing being laid out, and it would have been great to have been in some kind of a maybe vacated church, or just a large, even a warehouse, but having the painting set up with sacred lighting, candles, and the music, and procession, and so that you'd see all the entire body of work, and how each of the pieces relate to one another, and it helped tell the whole story, rather than just seeing one on Facebook and one here and one here. I always thought it'd be really great. In fact, my husband is an architect, and he's designed a few churches, and there's one church that was being revamped, and they were taking all of the furniture out. And so they gave it to me. I have pulpits and altar pieces and pews, and I've refinished them and everything. So it's still there, Joseph. It's the desire to do that, I just think would be magnificent. It, you know, would take a lot of money. Or I don't know, maybe not. Maybe doing it simply would be the best thing. But yeah, the passion is still there to carry that off. I have the one of the pulpits is down the hall here, and another one is in my garage. But I have a 25-foot arch that was over a baptistry that I would think my that triptych that you saw earlier would fit in there quite perfectly.
First of all, because I'm interested in self-portraits and in narrative painting, so I was wondering what you've learned, if you've learned anything from your self-portraits, Laura. You know, has the process of painting your self-portraits actually taught you anything about yourself?
Oh, lots. Lots. Well, like I said, you know, there's the process, and then afterwards, you know, a lot of times when we work, I don't know if this happens with everybody, but it's never right. You know, there's always like, it's not what you're trying to get. And so at some point, you stop and you go, look, this is better than it was 5 minutes ago because I ruined it 10 minutes ago. You know, I brought it back, stop. That happens to me a lot. And as I've gotten older, I've learned to quit when I think it's, when I recognize that things are working, even if it's not exactly what I think I want to see, because oftentimes it has a life of its own and it's pretty nice. And when I was younger, there was this effort to make it what I thought it was becoming. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? And I've kind of learned to just sort of recognize the difference. And that's, you know, older artists or people who were sort of a mentor, teacher people to me when I was in college would say you have to live life. You know, you've got more talent in your painting than I have in this, but you're not old enough or you haven't lived life. And I kind of know what they mean now. Because, you know, so there's a certain amount of a judgment or sense of trust that you are, I guess it's trust or confidence in your own judgment. So I've learned that. I've learned to trust my intuitions a lot, and I have learned about the importance of being honest. It sounds like such a cliche, but like putting it all out there, because there's a lot of work that, like I said, I have done for 40 years that isn't posted or shared anywhere because it was prior to the days of social media. And at times when I did share some of that work that was obviously imbued with some very painful symbolic elements, and some close friends who were artists may have seen them. Now I understand why they were a little uncomfortable, because it was so exposed that it was awkward. But I can see that now, and at the time I just felt like, oh, it's not really that good as an image. But in retrospect, I think it was because emotionally it was very uncomfortable, because it had to do with my internal conflicts with all that was going on in my life or our lives relationally, and, you know, in painful ways, not comfortable. And it was all there. So I'm going, oh, here's my art. It's a picture poem. And they would be like, oh, you know, but they knew everybody involved. And it was, you know, I think, well, it was all out there. Now I recognize that was connecting, but in a way that was TMI, you know, now it's too much information, even though they're not particularly narrative. Does that make sense? So I've learned a lot.
Yeah.
I think trust, and you know, you never know when your time is. So I kind of figure, like, if I'm going to put any time in, it's got to be something that I will live with, because most likely nobody will love it like I do, and it's not going to sell. And then, you know, ironically, that's the most private stuff. It's stuff that I wouldn't do to sell. But some people I admire have bought them. You know, like that's where my last story ended up. This artist said, I love that drawing way back a year ago, and she bought it over Thanksgiving, and I love her work. So that's, you know, I've learned the more honest you are, it connects, and that's what people want, because that's the stuff we're afraid to share. We don't talk to each other. That's my thing.
Also, like Regina, I started doing a master's because I could only do one person at a time, so I'm trying to do narrative paintings. So I wanted to ask her advice about how she actually builds the composition of the painting. Like, has she got any tips?
For me, my work starts, I have tons of folders, and I told you I have a lot of things I've bought. I have a huge collection of vintage fashion, and I have reliquaries. I have just a collection of things that have always inspired me, and I draw from those things. I have folders and folders and folders of imagery on my computer, and that I've categorized with, you know, trees and landscapes and hats and headdresses and animals, bugs, snakes, you know, just blah, 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 just so many things. So it continues to grow as I continue to collect things. And but I, as I stated before, I have a theme that I paint into. And so I collect the things that pertain to the theme. And so I just start, I'm inspired by them. They inspire me. And it's a specific thing that I'm wanting to speak about. So I find the things that build up the language for that one specific painting, and I just start organizing. Whether I set it up as the staging and light it, or whether I do it in Photoshop. And then I end up with an image that I'm either referencing, or lots of images that I'm referencing, but that's how I do it.
I want to know about the lighting, the reflected light, and making it all an integral, complete, unified painting. Like, do you find that you have your props and your setup and your staging, and like, do you have to, does it come with the light, the correct lighting already built in, or do you find you have to imagine that, or do you find that you have to use Photoshop to obtain that? So
yes to all of that.
Okay.
Yeah, I did the setting up is the ideal way to do it, so that you have all the lights and the shadows are all right, and if you have a window, it's illuminating your pieces, and you're taking all of that into consideration. Or if you're outside, that's, you know, even better. But I use the Photoshop a lot when I'm doing my more eclectic pieces, where I've gathered imagery and I'm putting it into one image. So I'll have a mannequin's body and a human head and doll heads around that, and none of it is there. It's you know, imaginative realism at this point. It's not realistic. It's not something that you could ever see in reality. But so my attempt to make it reality only goes so far, because I think if the eclecticness becomes part of some of the imagery, in that it feels uncomfortable. It feels just slightly disoriented, because I don't want you to feel real comfortable with the eclectic pieces. So, I mean, so sometimes trying to make everything perfect doesn't work. Don't fight what you're creating. Sometimes we can strive for perfection and it kind of ruins something that is really inherent within the creating process. And that's that disjointed sense that I'm going for sometimes. So I do both. I do all of those things.
Do you then fix like the highlights and the lighting then when you're on the fly?
Well, like if I'm pulling in something that's, you know, lit from the right, and I have two other things that are lit from the left, I'll reverse it, and I'll go in and I'll, you know, merge the images together, and I'll work the light and highlight and darken things and cast shadows to do things like that. Yeah, so it's a really cool tool. Imagination, Photoshop, reality, it all works.
Yeah.
I think it's just important to have, you know, if it's important to you, then it doesn't really matter. You know, right, you use the tools that you have or that are available, comfortable, whatever it is to make that note, that image, that message, that painting.
What I'm fascinated with is the rationale in the 21st century almost of how we could still focus on the self. I mean, everybody walking around with selfies should give us a clue that there's something wrong with us. But to start off with Elina's thing about the self is a controlled hallucination. Not only that it brings the external into the internal. And that, I think, is a fascinating rationale almost. I have trouble with, I mean, I do understand the powerful descriptions of both Laura's and Regina's work. The issue for me is justifying obsession or concentration to the self. How do we do that? And I think if we don't examine that, and I'm not saying it's wrong at all, but I think the kind of rationales that were given at the beginning by Ms. Cerla sort of draws the external world into the notion of the self. And I'm not sure that's always consciously done. And that's okay.
I don't know that it's necessarily consciously done, but I think in the same way that, because you're a writer, in the same way that you'll dedicate 2 hours of your day and you know, you're in your, wherever you are, you unplug to practice your craft, practice your conversation with yourself, and you reflect on the issues that mean something to you. For me, I just happen to be looking at my, let's say, my reflection, but it isn't a narcissistic aspect to it. There's more, it's the practice of my craft, and it's almost like a byproduct or an outgrowth of the practice of my craft that let's say I see the age in my eyes that wasn't there 4 years ago, but I didn't set out to draw that. I set out to record what's in the mirror. I'm trying to really simplify it. And for me, I'm using pencil right now. Drawing, erasing, and trying to record what I see, what is I've known since as long as I can remember, because we know ourselves better than anyone. And, you know, we are all vain, right? I mean, there is an aspect of vanity. You wouldn't buy, like you choose what you're going to wear, you choose sort of, you check how you look, and not to a selfie degree. I can't hold a camera and do a selfie. I don't do selfies. That's not, but my version of a selfie is much more meditative and introspective and spiritual, because I'm making something, you know, by hand for my it's poetry for me. the justification for that, to me personally, is that I already know sort of that I'm living according to what I feel is responsible as a human being, and part of my obligation is that I feel like I have this gift, and I do it to make myself healthy, and then, you know, it is what I think it's no less, maybe it's my form of activism, but art and music and books, you know, we've all been, and film, sorry, I shouldn't leave out film. We've all been relying on that in a sense. This dialogue is a narrative. And we have been clinging to this kind of thing to sort of help us connect, which is what art does, or a good book or a great poem, in times of solitude.
I also really enjoyed the question because it's that balance between being a first person perspective and realizing what that overindulgence of the first person perspective has done to our world. And I think the question is a really interesting one, because it's how do we deal with the fact that it is part of who we are and weave it into our existence as embodied beings in the world.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I don't consider self-portraits narcissistic. I spend so much of my time not dealing with myself, that when it's time and I need to rejuvenate and replenish and revive and increase my esteem, doing self-portraits for me is an act of self-love. I always love myself more after I've done that. So I don't feel it's narcissistic at all, you know, for everybody.
What I find is kind of an interesting lack of self. You know, like I wonder about the presupposition of a self a lot. And I think that, Bob, in your question, you know, often what I think goes on in self-portraiture is a search for the self and a construction of the self, a little bit less than an observation of the self. And I wanted to ask both Laura and Regina, I see, because from my perspective, there's a difference in your approaches to that kind of notion of construction versus searching for the self. But I do wonder an awful lot about the very existence of the self and the presupposition of that. The more I do self-portraiture, the less I feel, the more evasive myself is. And I think there's a real truth to that. And I think that it's a very healthy endeavor for that reason. That Emily Dickinson poem, "I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too?" The recognition of that, or the realization of that, can be profound, and that often comes from trying to look at yourself. You might find less of a self than you think is there.
You know, I'd love to interject something there, because I'm so fascinated by the fact that we so need to cling on to this narrative of the self that is almost immovable, and neuroscience and art is showing that that isn't the case, that it's something that is constructed, it's renegotiated, it's rewritten, like memories are rewritten, and it's something that's in constant flux. And that movement between needing to express and needing to write as we go along, construct as we go along, is a really interesting one. And it's linked to the idea of how much does the self need to revindicate its own experience, and how much does it need to listen to the external world, the experience of other selves. And there I'm not just talking about human selves, but the experience of being an embodied being in the planet today and how that has an impact. And all of that is constantly rewiring. So in a sense, the only thing that I'd kind of like to add to that is the idea that for me, it's so important to kind of let go of this axiomatic need to have a fixed answer, because sometimes the answer shifts, and sometimes we need to be writing the self, sometimes we need to be expressing the self, because it depends on political situation, on contextual information, and so many different things.
My expression of self is self in general, while I'm drawing from my own experiences, I'm talking about self and self-scrutiny and comparison. And I mean, we can only compare ourselves to others if we're looking at ourselves, right? So, I mean, there's that action of self in the work.
Painting might seem a solitary occupation, and probably particularly self-portraiture, but I wanted to sort of leave on this note that creation of the self is inherently and unavoidably collaborative. You put somebody in solitary confinement, they go mad. There is no self left in solitary after a while. And so while painting may seem solitary, painting the self-portrait and constructing identity may seem solitary. Fundamentally, whether you show your paintings in public or not, whether you have a small audience for your work or a large one, the self is inherently a social and collaborative creation.
I completely agree, and I think that it's something that constant renegotiation of self, other, and how we define the relationships that we inhabit is fundamental.
I'm going to add, is that because the viewer has to respond, or it's like they're meeting someone for the first time? I'm just wondering, you know. I mean, I think it's true, but
it's a social interaction. The art form is it's a form of communication, just like writing or music or dance or theater. In many cases, what we're communicating with the art, or whatever forms we're communicating in, our self becomes a little bit transparent to the message that we're communicating. We can communicate about ourselves, and we often do. We can communicate about issues. Bob Chianesi was referencing the environmental concerns or social concerns. And Laura, you talked about the using it as a means to reinforce and re-nurture our own selves. And these are all valid things. If you thought of it like a statement, like a communication form, at the end of some sentences, you get to the end and there's a period at the end. End of sentence. Everything you need to know is communicated right there. Regina's work, you get to the end of, and it's a question mark. It just barely opens the door. It opens to a whole world of things to wonder about. You don't look at it and go, oh, I got it. Like you might with for example, a landscape or something. You look at a landscape, beautiful landscape, great sunset, fantastic lighting, beautiful stream. I'd like to walk down that trail. But with a work that ends in a question mark like Regina's, it just barely opens the door. You have a world of things to think about and to explore.
It's just been fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm so honored to have been here. It's wonderful dialogue. Thank you.
Me too. And thank you for all who showed up. And thank you, Elina, and everyone. And, hopefully we'll connect again.
Well, I hope so. The idea of the dialogues is also that we create a space where everybody can exchange ideas and question. And when questioning comes up, I hope that people kind of leave, because I know I leave, asking myself more questions. Thank you once again, Regina Jacobson and Laura Tan, for your amazing contributions today. It's been fascinating.
See ya. See ya, Gerald.
Bye. See you guys.
Bye.
Thank you for doing this.